Coming up on a special edition of Big Ten Live, get out your calendars, get ready to circle some dates. Hoop schedules coming your way. Robbie Hummel and I will dissect the key dates for the men. Rick Pizzo and Shimmy Miller dive into the biggest games for the women. Less than 2 months from the start of the season, we're talking hoop showdowns. The Big Ten Live schedule release special now. Welcome in. It's our Big Ten Live special. We're presented by IFS.AI. Dave Remsen and Robbie Hummel, Rick and Shimmy here in just a bit. It's hard to believe. It's warm outside. It feels like summer, but we're looking ahead to the winter, and there is going to be no lack of games to watch, Robbie. This is a hoops junkie's dream, this 18-team league every night of the week.
Absolutely. You look at the caliber of teams that are going to be playing every night in the Big Ten Conference. Football just started, but it's so cool that we're already talking some hoops. And how about the new digs? This looks
pretty nice. Your first time in here.
First
right?
time in the studio.
Yeah, so. First time we've unveiled the basketball look. Before we get to the schedule, a couple of nuggets here. Just want to, first of all, shout out Brad Taylor on the men's side, Megan Kahn on the women's side, Kevin Palga, who is a schedule consultant for the league. This is a massive puzzle. Sure. 180 men's games, 162 women's games. Not easy to put this together. Tireless work on their part. So kudos to them. And then just a few nuggets for you to help you understand what we're going to see here today. This is not the day where you learn the opponents. We've already revealed the opponents. The news today is the dates of the game, when these games are actually happening. Television network info should follow within the next few weeks. So a reminder of how this works. The men are once again playing 20 conference games, 18 schools now in the conference, every school playing every other school at least once. The math comes out to 14 one plays, 7 home, 7 away, and 3 two plays, school that play each other both home and away. So everyone has 10 road games, 10 home games. The 2 plays were announced back in May. So again, that is not news today. The news is when they play one another. Robbie, you've had a chance to look at these schedules. What stands out to you?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and look, I'm not that far removed from playing in the Big Ten Conference, although 2012 is getting further and further away. But when I was playing, there was a couple games where you're like, all right, we can get right against this team. Or like, this is a game that, as long as we show up, we should win. Look across the board. For every school that we've got in the Big Ten Conference, everybody is competitive. Everybody has the ability to put a high-level product on the floor. And I just am like, when you look at these schedules, there are 4-game stretches, 5-game stretches where you're like, if we go 2-2 or we go 2-3, it's probably a win because you're talking about travel, you're talking about the caliber of opponent, and you're talking about overall talent level in this conference. It is off the charts, and it's going to be great for the fans. Maybe not for the coaches because they're going to lose some sleep over how do I game plan for all these good teams. But when you're talking about strength of schedule, it's not going to be a problem for teams in the Big Ten Conference.
Speaking of coaches, let's start with the man who coached you, Matt Painter, and the Purdue Boilermakers, of course, national runners-up a year ago, their first Final Four in more than 40 years. They did lose Zach Edey, the 2-time National Player of the Year, but they get an outstanding backcourt back. Fletcher Lawyer, Braden Smith. Should be another very good year for Purdue. Let's take a look at their schedule, and it begins life without Zach Edey at Penn State. December the 5th, they play Indiana, Michigan, and Rutgers twice. The Indiana games are always of interest. First one at home on a Friday night, January 31st. Play in Bloomington, February 23rd. Every Big Ten team plays 2 conference games in December. For Purdue, those games are at Penn State and home against Maryland. As for the Hoosiers, they didn't make the NCAA tourney last year. They were very active, though, in the portal. They play Ohio State and Penn State twice in addition to the Boilers. Open with Minnesota at home December 9th. Big one against Illinois in Bloomington January 14th. Host UCLA on Valentine's Day. 2 storied programs there. Just 1 trip out west. That's in March, and you will see a trend here. All of the Central and Eastern time zone teams head west once. They'll play back-to-back games in 4 days to minimize the length of time away from campus. Illinois, an Elite Eight team a year ago, overhauled roster. 2 players at Northwestern, Michigan State, and Wisconsin. They open with the Cats December 6th in Evanston, then head to Madison the following Tuesday. Their West Coast trip is in early January. Host UCLA on February 11th, and the regular season at home against Purdue March 7th, Robbie.
Well, I think the schedule here, when you look at what Illinois is dealing with, their last 6 is a gauntlet. And they're going to be, I think, one of those teams that's contending. They're in the top tier as far as where they are at right now. And we were laughing about with Brad Underwood. A lot of these coaches don't like this new format of, like, you reload your team. Maybe he does. You know, he goes out here. He's rebuilt teams. I think chemistry is going to be interesting to see how they gel. But their last 6 games of UCLA, Michigan State, at Wisconsin, Iowa, at Michigan, and Purdue, that's a gauntlet to finish the season. And that's one of those kind of 5 or 6 game stretches that I was talking about, where if you can come away and split, you're probably feeling pretty good about it.
It's going to be fascinating to see how that team comes together. Ty Rodgers is the only returning player who averaged more than 3 points per game. So kind of how do you piece it together there? Again, I agree with you. I think Brad Underwood actually really enjoys that challenge on a year-to-year basis. They got 2 Euros who they feel very good about and really very active this summer. That roster looks so different than it did after they lost to UConn.
You know, Big Ten fans maybe don't know the name Kasparas Jakasjonas right now, but they're going to get to know him. You look at all the draft information that's out there, there's a good chance that he's a first-round pick in the 2025 NBA draft. Has played well in the FIBA competitions. You've got the Euro recruits that you talked about. Now, I will say, just from being an American that has gone overseas to play professionally, there can be an adjustment period where you're away from home, and granted, he's played in the FB Barcelona system, which is really, really high-level basketball. But, you know, you're in the United States for maybe the first time in your life. You're away from your friends. You're away from your family. How do those guys adjust? But also on top of that, a guy like Kylan Boswell to come in and run the show, having played at Arizona, there is a lot of talent on this Illinois roster.
I want to talk about Purdue and Indiana. Purdue feels like maybe a little more backcourt driven.
Yes, I think so. I think you can make the case that the backcourt of Purdue is the best in the conference. Fletcher Lawyer, Braden Smith. I love the fact that you look at Miles Colvin and you look at Cam Heide, 2 guys that maybe didn't play a ton on last year's national runner-up team, but got the experience of being there, got to play meaningful minutes in those games. And I think that Trey Kaufman-Renn is a guy that is expected to be a breakout candidate in this league. They'll play him. You can play him at the 4. You can play him at the 5. I think that the 4 is probably better suited for him just because of the physicality of this league. The question that I have for Purdue is who does fill the gaping void at center, being that you've lost Zach Edey. Is that a Will Berg? Is that freshman Daniel Jacobson? You know, this roster is very talented. I agree that the guards are very proven. But this, to me, if Trey Kaufman-Renn takes that jump, this could be one of the better teams in the league.
So some familiar names there in West Lafayette, not as much a portal-driven team. Indiana, driven by the portal, but you also have Mackenzie Mbako. You've got Renew coming back. You've got Galloway.
Sure.
So this is a little bit of a mix here for Mike Woodson. A big year for them.
And you look at their portal class, there's no doubt that Indiana upgraded their talent in the backcourt. And that was something they had to do. Galloway is a great piece, but you look at Cannon Carlisle coming over from Stanford, Miles Rice from Washington State. Those are 2 guys that can put the ball in the basket. Their shooting percentage is maybe not what Indiana fans, you know, the shooting of the 3 has been such a large topic of discussion, but there's no doubt. You bring those 2 guys in, they have upgraded their talent in the backcourt. I think Luke Goody is a great addition because he brings that shooting, and then Umar Ballo, you know, he's one of the top transfers that was out there coming over from Arizona. The only thing I will say, obviously shooting is still a question. How does this roster fit together when, again, you're probably going to look at playing Mbako at the 3, Renew at the 4, and Ballo at the 5. But Mike Woodson's going to have options. He can be flexible and play big, or he can play small.
That, to me, is the fascinating part where you talk about whether you've built a program with guys who have been there or you try to fit these disparate pieces together. We've seen it work fabulously in this league, and we've also seen times where it doesn't.
Yeah, and Illinois is a great example. 2 years ago, didn't work as well. Last year, worked really well. Go to the Elite Eight.
A year ago, no doubt. So that's the story with the old guard. Let's check out the new schools in the Big Ten. Start with Oregon. Dane Altman's team on the bubble, entering the Pac-12 tourney last year. They went out and won it. It's a program that's won at least 20 games in each of his 14 seasons in Eugene. UCLA missed the NCAA tourney last year after making 3 straight Sweet 16s. Mick Cronin attacked the portal with a vengeance, also bring back 3 double-digit scores. USC in transition. Eric Musselman takes over, replacing Andy Enfield. Essentially an entirely new roster. They don't bring back anyone who averaged more than 4 points per game. Washington also has a new coach. Danny Sprinkle comes from Utah State, led the Aggies to the NCAA tourney in his lone season there, replaces Mike Hopkins, who was let go after 7 years on Montlake. Let's look at the schedules. Again, this was announced in May, but just a reminder, the 4 new West schools all play one another twice. So for instance, with Washington, their 2 players are Oregon, UCLA, and USC. And they play all their December games against the 2 other teams from that grouping, meaning no one in the conference has to cross multiple time zones in December. Washington, for instance, at UCLA December 3rd, home against USC on the 7th. You also note regional games on the back end as well, and this holds for every team, so no one heads into the conference tourney after a long-haul road trip. As for Oregon, they start at USC on December the 4th, then host UCLA on the 8th. Something else to note here, the road trips for the one plays, there are 4 of them. 3 include back-to-back games. So for instance, at Ohio State and Penn State in January, at Michigan and Michigan State, and at Iowa and Wisconsin in February. That is an effort to minimize travel, and you will note that same model is followed for all of the West Coast teams. So Robbie, give people a sense for these 2, Oregon and Washington, starting with the Ducks.
Well, Oregon was a team that last year you watched them end of the season. They were playing their best basketball of the season. They probably played in the best NCAA tournament game that we had. The Creighton double overtime game was phenomenal. Dana Altman brings a good amount back. Yes, in Fale Dante, that's a big loss, especially when you think about just his impact defensively. Jermaine Couisnard, also a very talented guard that was big time in the NCAA tournament. But Jackson Shellstad is a player. Kwame Evans is a guy that I think you could look at as one of those guys that could really break out. And then I think when you look at the returners, and I'll throw Nate Biddle in there, even though he didn't play a ton last year due to some health issues. You get him back healthy, and then you get this transfer portal class. TJ Bamba, 2 years ago, he really scored it in the Pac-12. Kind of a weird season this last year at Villanova, but he can make shots from the perimeter. Brandon Angel, you have to imagine Dana Altman's seen plenty of him. He was at Stanford. He's a guy that can play the 4 and can really stretch the floor. I think Supreme Cook's a good pickup because of the way he offensive rebounds the basketball. And you look at Raheem Moss, like that dude can score the ball from Toledo. So you've got, with Oregon, I think a team that's flying under the radar, that's one of the better teams in this league, that's probably not being talked about. Dana Altman can coach. They've got the talent. Oregon is a team that definitely can make some noise in this league.
He's had a Final Four team there at Oregon, so great evidence of his ability to coach. Really interested in Washington. We were talking about Illinois and all the roster turnover. Washington's another team that, due to a coaching change, and how these pieces fit together will be fascinating.
Well, and Danny Sprinkle, you look at kind of his coaching resume as he made his way from Montana State, made the NCAA tournament the last 2 years there, took over at Utah State last year, had a very similar situation where the roster is gutted due to the portal because of a coach leaving. He comes in there, brings his own guys in, and you look at what they were in the tournament. They're playing in the second round against Purdue. Great Ozabor is certainly the name to watch as he follows his head coach from Utah State over to Washington. And I think the interesting thing to look for as they kind of make their way throughout this season, DJ Davis, talented scorer from Butler. The point guard situation, keeping Zoom Diallo, top 40 recruit, was huge. He was recruited by Mike Hopkins. Hopkins obviously gets fired. Keeping him in the program as a Seattle kid, really big. Will he be the starting point guard? Will it be Luis Corkwright? That will be interesting to kind of see how that pans out. But, you know, there's so much roster turnover. There's so much unknown. We'll talk about USC, and it's pretty much the same thing with them as well.
That's the story then with the Pacific Northwest schools. Let's take a look at the LA schools. UCLA, this is a team many people feel could contend for the conference title. Mentioned the games with the Huskies and the Ducks in December. Some other games of note, they host Michigan State on February 4th. That road trip in mid-February at Illinois and Indiana, potentially really huge in the conference race, Rob.
Well, and I just look at that stretch from January 4th to January 17th, and not so much because of the opponents, but because of the travel. And this is something that these West Coast schools are certainly going to deal with. They are at Nebraska, they play Michigan back in Los Angeles, then they fly across the country to Maryland, they get Rutgers, then they go home and play Iowa. Certainly managing your fatigue and managing your schedule, a big part of what our 4 West Coast schools are going to have to do.
As for USC, really fascinated to see what this group looks like. They have that same Indiana-Illinois trip in January, again, minimizing the travel by pairing those games. They host the Bruins on a Monday night, January 27th, go to Northwestern and Purdue in early February. Let's start with UCLA as we break these teams down. Did really well in the portal. This was a team that struggled mightily offensively. Mick Cronin pledged that they would be better, and you look at this roster, and there's no doubt
they're better. But yeah, 16 and 17 last year. It's one of those things where when you look at UCLA and you look at the roster or the record next to them, it's just so surprising to see a year like that. Certainly changes had to be made. I love Mick Cronin's quote where he said, "Our NIL went up exponentially." And that's why you look at this roster. But, Sebastian Mack and Dylan Andrews, that's a good place to start. I think Dylan Andrews could be one of the better point guards in this league when this season is all said and done. But the portal is certainly the story here. Sky Clark comes over from Louisville. You've got Kobe Johnson coming over from USC. He can really guard. He will set the tone. And I think Mick Cronin, even though they haven't been a team that's been necessarily super aggressive defensively, I think with his personnel and with the depth that they have, and also with a guy like William Kyle, who is the Summit League Defensive Player of the Year from last season, I think they're going to be really aggressive. I think they'll pressure you. I think they're going to go deep. And I think that they're going to try to force turnovers with some half and full court pressure.
To me, depth is the operative phrase there. It really does look like it's a roster with a lot of different options. What about for Eric Musselman? He was one of those guys who's in that spot where you just have to figure out how to piece it together, but they've got some nice pieces.
No, I mean, the talent they've brought in, and he's going to be a problem in Southern California because of the amount of talent that resides out there. And USC, I think you could look at, especially with him being the head coach, with his success, his transfers, with his ability. He's coached in the CBA, the NBA, the G League, now obviously college basketball over the last 10 years. But they are going to have talent. It's going to be about how well does that talent come together. Desmond Claude from Xavier, he can go. Clark Slackert is a guy that a lot of people wanted in that transfer portal. We know Terrence Williams. He had a good year at Michigan last year. They've got talent. It's just about how well does it fit together, much like for the Washington Huskies.
It was disappointing last year, but this is a team that had been to 3 straight NCAA tournaments before then. There's a lot of potential, no doubt, for SC. So much more to come on our show. Lots more on the men's side, a deep dive into what's ahead for some of the tourney teams from last year, the Spartans, the Badgers, Huskers, and Wildcats. But next, we'll focus on the women's game. And once again, the Big Ten figures to have the sport's biggest superstar. Rick Pizzo and Shimmy Miller have that story next.
The Caitlin Clark effect may have moved from Big Ten basketball courts to the WNBA, but that doesn't mean it is not still being felt inside the world of college basketball, as 2024-25 does mark the post-Caitlin Clark era, but the sport still riding a wave of momentum and popularity it has never seen before. Rick Pizzo now joined by Shimmy Miller as we get you set for the 2024-25 Big Ten basketball season. It does feel a little bit different without Caitlin Clark, but that doesn't mean there aren't faces of women's college basketball, and many of them reside right here in the Big Ten.
Everyone who just jumped on the Big Ten women's bandwagon last year, you have permission to stay aboard. It's going to be another great season.
Should be a fun ride with players like Juju Watkins and Kiki Rice and Cody McMahon and so many others that we'll get to in just a second. But the point of us being here is to show you the conference schedules for all 18 Big Ten conference teams, and it remains an 18-game conference schedule. So, Shimmy, it's very simple. That means you play every opponent once, but there is one to-play opponent, and that opponent in every single case is both a geographic and historic rival.
I love this format. You get to keep your natural rival, which is great for the fan basis, but it also gives coaches a little flexibility to schedule in the non-conference with only 18 games in the conference slate.
And the Big Ten and all the schedulers there doing amazing work trying to make sure that the travel isn't too much on any team. You will see a lot of the West Coast trips put together, and for the West Coast teams, the same deal when they come to the Midwest. and they come east. Let's get into some of the schedules, and we start with the Ohio State Buckeyes. You see their 2 games in December against Illinois and then at Rutgers. Remember, the women will all play 1 game in early December, 1 in late December or early January, and you see the 2 play for Ohio State. The Maryland Terrapins, another team, as always with Brenda Frese, expected to be toward the top of the Big Ten standings. It is life after Caitlin Clark, but Hannah Stuelke is back, Sita Falter, and others for Jan Jensen as she takes over for the future Hall of Famer Lisa Bluter. The 2 play for the Iowa women, Nebraska, as they start on the road at Michigan State, finish up at home against Wisconsin. And then the Indiana Hoosiers, Terry Morin has built herself an annual championship contender. Their December games at Penn State and home against Wisconsin. The 2 plays against in-state rival Purdue, but not until later in the season, February the 15th at home, and then March the 2nd in West Lafayette. Of course, Shimmy, none of those 3 teams rebuild, they reload. I mentioned J.C. Sheldon. You also lose Celeste Taylor if you're Kevin McGuff, but there is plenty of talent coming back. Taylor Theory and a potential player of the year in Cody McMahon.
Well, you've got Cody coming back, but Kevin McGuff, he hit the transfer jackpot. He got Chance Gray out of Oregon. And then he got a 5-star freshman, Jelani Cambridge, who's coming in to take over at the point guard position. So you're right. It's just a reloading over in Columbus. But if I'm Kevin McGuff, I've got my eyes circled on those LA schools. He dipped his toe into the Southern California waters. Last season, he lost to both USC and UCLA. I believe that the Big Ten Championship is going to go through LA. So I've got my eyes circled on those games.
We'll get to the Trojans and the Bruins in just a second. But first, the Hawkeyes, national runners-up in each of the last 2 seasons. Obviously, the biggest loss is Caitlin Clark, but Kate Martin's gone, Gabby Marshall is gone as well. This will look like a very different team, and no Lisa Bluter on the sidelines either.
Well, you've got a new coach in Jan Jensen.
New in quote marks, yes.
But you got Hannah Stuelke returning. You have Sydney Falter returning, and Sydney had a fantastic Big Ten tournament. But you got Lucy Olson, transfer, coming in from Villanova. Now, she's not going to make people forget about Caitlin Clark, but she is going to pick up some of that scoring load that Caitlin Clark is left off.
Indiana has produced so many phenomenal players during Terry Morin's time. You think back to whether it's Tyra Buss or Grace Berg or most recently Mackenzie Holmes. She's gone, as is Sarah Scalia. But Yarden Garzone is a player that can shoot from pretty much anywhere, and Sid Parrish brings a lot, including veteran leadership.
I like this team with Indiana, and I hope that people aren't sleeping on what they're going to do over in Bloomington. Terry Morin has this thing rolling. I think they finish strong. They finish with 3 of their last 5 at home. They play the Northwest teams early. So I think their schedule behooves Indiana.
All right, well, you teased the arrival of the West Coast schools because it was the heyday of women's basketball in LA last year. Both USC and UCLA with phenomenal seasons. Had the chance to meet and talk with Lindsay Gottlieb for the first time this summer during the Big Ten Conference Summit. Such an impressive young coach. On the rise as one of the best in this profession. And okay, Juju Watkins is also there. She will certainly be one of the faces of women's college basketball this coming season. But it's not just UCLA. When you go out to the City of Angels, Corey Close has done this at a high level for a very long time. And she has a couple of really good players back. Kiki Rice is there. Remember, this is a team that finished 27-7 last year, reached the NCAA Tournament Sweet 16, and I don't think we expect anything less from that team this season. Take a look at these schedules. UCLA first, Washington to open things up on December 8th, and you know they're going to play USC twice, of course. And again, these games later in the year on the road, short roadie on February the 13th, and then finishing up at home against the Trojans on March the 1st. As for that USC schedule, their early December game also sticking close to the West Coast on the road at Oregon. Also, a couple of interesting road trips here. They go to Iowa and to Maryland as part of the road schedule for USC in 2024-25. When it comes to USC and Juju Watkins, Lindsay Gottlieb told me she's not worried about being the next Caitlin Clark. She's worried about being the first Juju Watkins. And while that alone is clearly not enough, as good as she is, Gottlieb did go into the portal, get a really important post player, and this is a very good roster outside of Juju Watkins.
Loaded from top to bottom, positions 1 through 5. You got Kiki Ariafen from Stanford, who probably could have gone pro and would have been a high draft pick this past year, decided to go to USC. But they also went to Oregon State, and they got Talia Van Olhoffen, and another dynamic scorer. Now, USC, they've got a tough schedule, Rick. They start at Oregon, which is a tough place to play, but they finish at UCLA. So they start tough, they finish tough going into the Big Ten tournament.
As for UCLA, talked about Corey Close and how long she has done this at such a high level. Kiki Rice is back, another terrific young star, but you have Lauren Betts, who really started to establish herself last year in the NCAA tournament as a post player. Gabriela Jaquez will likely play a larger role coming off the bench. This, much like USC, a roster that goes very deep.
Same thing. She went over to Texas A&M and got Janiyah Barker out of the transfer portal. So this UCLA team's loaded. That's what Corey does, though. She's one of the best recruiters in the country. But they play USC twice. And I think what you could be seeing is a preview, maybe a preview of Big Ten championship game.
All right, well, those two West Coast teams will battle it out for dominance in LA. Two others trying to own the Pacific Northwest, that being Oregon and Washington. As we look at the Huskies conference schedule, yes, a home opener against UCLA to start things. The two games against Oregon, that is the two-play opponent for Washington, come in mid-February, and the final game of the season. You see those back-to-back roadies at Michigan State, at Michigan, at Ohio State, at Penn State. That is what the league is trying to do to help the West Coast schools with all the travel. As for Oregon, it'll be UCLA, or USC, I should say, to start things on December the 7th. Those two games against Washington later in the year. And again, the back-to-back road trips you see for Oregon in late January and early February. They'll be in the Mitten State, Minnesota, and Nebraska in the middle of February. Now, Oregon has had a lot of success under Kelly Graves, but the last 2 years haven't quite been up to the standard he set. What do we expect from the Ducks this coming season?
A much improved Oregon Ducks team. He went in the transfer portal. He brought 7 transfers in, 2 freshmen, so 9 new players, complete overhaul for Kelly Graves. If I'm Kelly, the games that I'm looking at Ohio State and at Indiana and at Michigan State, because those are 3 of his former players who left that, were part of the reason why he struggled so much the last couple of years.
That is the day and age that we live in with the transfer portal in college basketball. Tina Langley, like every other coach at Washington, has tried to use the transfer portal as well, but she had a younger roster and a developing roster last year, and the best news for all coaches in that regard, it means those players, when they do come back with more experience.
Well, she returns 4 of her 5 leading scorers, and this is Tina Langley, who coached with Brenda Frese when Brenda Frese came into the Big Ten and just absolutely dominated from the start. She knows what she's doing. She knows how to build a program, and she does it on defense. She held opponents to less than 60 points a game, so defense travels.
We will have much more, touch on all the remaining schools inside the Big Ten and their conference schedules for this coming season. On the women's side, Maryland, Michigan State, Michigan, Nebraska, all trying to get back to the tournament. Plus, Dave and Robbie are back to discuss Steve Peichel and the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, the greatest recruiting class in program history and one of the tops in the nation, what it means this year. Find out coming up next.
Back to the men's schedule. Tom Izzo and Michigan State will look to add to their Big Ten record run with their 27th straight NCAA tourney appearance. They start things off in December with Minnesota and Nebraska. Gophers are one of their 2 plays. As always, they'll play Michigan twice. They'll have to wait a while for those matchups in Ann Arbor, February 21st, then the regular season finale in East Lansing. Wisconsin made it to the championship game of the Big Ten tourney last year. A game in Champaign figures to be one of the better December matchups. West Coast trip is at UCLA and USC mid-January. They have 4 of their first 6 and 4 of their last 6 conference games at home. That final stretch includes visits from Illinois and Oregon. Northwestern looking to make it 3 straight NCAA tourneys. They begin life without Blue Buie. 3 of their first 4 conference games on the road, including a visit to Purdue. Have a stretch of 6 of 8 at home in the middle of the season. Includes Michigan State and Indiana coming to Welsh Ryan. And some thoughts on that trio of tourney teams from last year, Robbie, starting with the Spartans.
Yeah, I think for all three of these teams, certainly questions about the backcourt for Michigan State. It's who can replace Tyson Walker as that go-to guy. Is that Jaden Akins who takes a big jump? Is that Frankie Fiddler? It's just going to be interesting to see kind of who for the Spartans can be the guy that when they need a basket, they give him the ball and they get out of the way.
Be interesting to see if they can get back to being an elite team. They've been a 7-seed or worse in the last 4 NCAA tourneys. What about Wisconsin? Nice run late last year. Can they build on that without a few of their big guns?
Well, and they've been so immune from the transfer portal, and that was not the case. You lose A.J. Storr, you lose Chucky Hepburn, but they were able to replenish it with some other players. I think the point guard situation is really, really interesting. Is it going to be a freshman in Daniel Freitag? Is it transfer Cameron Hunter? Who is running the show? Because they do have some good pieces with Max Klesmit and Stephen Crowell.
What about Northwestern? Life without Bowie, speaking of backcourt questions. But Brooks Barnheiser coming back in Evanston.
Yeah, 6 of the top 8 are back in Evanston. I think Barnheiser's a good piece. I think Ty Berry is a good piece. It's once again, who is running the show? Is Jalen Leach going to be the guy that comes over from Fairfield, averaged 18 points a game? Can he get these guys into their offense? Bowie was just so good in the clutch, and he'd become a guy where he understood when is it his time to score, when is it his time to pass, and then the clutch gene. They've got a lot to replace, but I think Chris Collins does have a good nucleus.
And then Matthew Nicholson's health, I think, is a big deal. Did not play on their European trip as he continues to heal from that foot injury. Few more schedules, including another tourney team from last season in Nebraska, 3-seed in the Big Ten tourney last year, their best ever. They lose Keisei Tominaga. That was expected. They lost Rink Mass, too. He's unfortunately out for the year. They have a tough December at Michigan State, home against Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, Ohio State, the 2 plays. Go to Iowa City in January, and then finish out the regular season with the Hawks in Lincoln. The most anticipated season in Rutgers history, a team with 2 of the nation's top 3 recruits, Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, get Purdue as one of their 2 plays. Those figure to be highly anticipated games. Have them at Jersey Mike's Arena January the 9th, then in West Lafayette the first week of March. That second Purdue game, part of a finishing stretch of 4 of 6 on the road, including their lone West Coast swing. Maryland tried to bounce back from a tough year. They lost a ton of close games, really struggled on the offensive end, but Julian Reese is back. Mega recruit Derek Queen. They'll get a good test in December at Purdue. Their West Coast trip is early when conference play resumes in January. That is to coincide with winter break, and the conference tried to do that when possible. Tough road swing in late January at Illinois and Indiana. Let's start breaking down these teams a little bit, Robbie. Nebraska's interesting. Really feel bad about Rink Mass, but they got some nice portal pieces, some familiar names for Big Ten fans.
No doubt. And I think that when you talk about Bryce Williams and Jawan Gary, that's a really solid place to start. Williams could easily be one of the better players in the Big Ten Conference. The point guard situation, I think, is solid. Rolly Worster's been a winner in his career. I think Aaron Eulis, being a guy that ran the scout team all of last year, understanding what they're trying to do. The Mass thing is really tough, but I still think the momentum that Nebraska has is very real. And even though they'll be different at the 5 spot, they can still be a team that's a factor in the Big Ten.
And then Connor Essegian and Gavin Griffiths as well. Griffiths coming over from Rutgers. I mean, this roster, when you look at a team that legitimately might have 2 lottery picks playing for Rutgers here, what do you think about their chances of surrounding those guys with enough talent to really make some noise?
Yeah, and on top of that, you've got a guy in Jeremiah Williams who gets eligible late in the season last year and ended up doing some very positive things, won a Big Ten Player of the Week award. I like the shooting that they've surrounded the talent of Harper and Ace Bailey with. That you go to the portal, you get guys that can make shots from the perimeter to open that floor up. The loss of Cliff Amore, to me, stings because you're like, man, he fits really well with this roster. Is it going to be Emmanuel Abole? Is it going to be a freshman in Lathan Somerville? The questions at the 5 spot are very real, but there's no denying the hype around this Rutgers team. It's going to build and build, and they're going to have to handle that. That's going to be a real factor here.
No questions inside for Maryland. They've got plenty of answers there.
And that's where the strength of this team really starts. And you're talking about Julian Reese, who's an all-conference caliber player. Derek Queen is a guy that I think that the The buildup and the hype around him is very real. He can pass. He certainly is a terrific rebounder. I like the pieces they went out and added. You lose a guy in Jameer Young, and Jacoby Gillespie, the transfer from Belmont, comes over. He's going to have the opportunity to really run the show. I think Selton Miguel is one of the underrated transfer portal pickups of the Big Ten offseason. Comes over from USF, has played at Kansas State, 1,000-point scorer, shot really well from three. He really guards. He's a guy that can make some noise. And Deshaun Harris-Smith is back for the Terrapins as well.
Shot really well from three is the operative phrase there, because that's an area where they really need to get better.
That.
Yes, they need that desperately. We still have 5 men's teams to cover, including a couple new coaches, Dusty May, Jake Diebler, starting new chapters at Michigan and Ohio State. But Rick and Shimmy rejoin us next. Plenty more women's schedules to dissect, including the Nittany Lions and Fighting Illini. This is Big Ten Live.
Brenda Free's always going to have a strong roster, but no matter who's on the bench, count out Coach Freeze at your own peril. Heading into this season, here's the conference slate for the Terps, opening up on the road against Purdue. The 2-play against Ohio State. What a great rivalry this one has become. The first meeting against the Buckeyes in Columbus in late January, and finishing up the regular season at home against Ohio State on March the 2nd. What a start for Robin Freilich in East Lansing. Trying to build on that, take one step further. Spartans open up conference play in December at home against Iowa. As you may expect, the 2-play for Michigan State against their in-state rivals from Ann Arbor. And speaking of the Wolverines, they'll get things started against Northwestern. Finish at Illinois. I know that is months away. That could be a monster game for both teams when you start to talk about NCAA tournament hopefuls and teams that many consider to be bubble teams before the year even begins, as we look at Maryland, Michigan State, and Michigan's schedules. Rick Pizzo back with Shimmy Miller. I'm serious when I say that about Brenda Freeze. It doesn't really matter who's playing for her, because they are going to play so hard, and they're going to be a team that is, if not in, certainly in the conversation for the NCAA tournament.
Good news for Brenda. She went in the transfer portal, hit jackpot. She's got a lot of depth this year. Keep your eyes circled on that Washington matchup. No one knows each other like Tina Langley and Brenda Freeze.
As for Michigan State, Robin Freilich was able to lean on a veteran team last year. Several of those vets are gone. Julia Ayrault, however, is back, a player who really emerged last season.
And they picked up Grace Van Sluten from Oregon in the portal. She'll help a lot, too. But they've got a really tough schedule, Rick. Their last 5 games are against potential NCAA tournament teams.
As for Michigan, Kim Barnes-Arico also has some roster turnover, most notably Layla Filia, one of the better players in this league a year ago, now playing at Texas.
They got Jordan Hobbs back, though, and I think she's going to have a breakout season. They've got a favorable schedule, 3 of their last 5 at home.
All right, speaking of schedules, that's the entire reason why we're here. So let's take a look at some more. We go to Nebraska. Alexis Markowski is back. That'll be the focal point for the Huskers, who open up against Minnesota. The 2-play again, as we told you earlier when we showed you the Iowa schedule, the Iowa Hawkeyes on the road in mid-January, at home in mid-February. Illinois is a team that returns 2 really good players in Genesis Bryant and Makira Cook. Their 2-play against Northwestern. You'll know a lot about this team early on in the schedule as they open at Ohio State and then play at home against Oregon. And as for those aforementioned Cats, Joe McEwen, a guy who has been there, done that. Northwestern opening up against Michigan. They'll finish the year against Nebraska after those 2 plays against Illinois. All right, let's dive into Nebraska a little bit. Amy Williams and company had to go through some adversity last year, and now they go through life after Jazz Shelley.
Well, it certainly helps, though, when you have the double queen, Alexis Markowski, back. I like Nebraska's schedule. They play 2 of their last 3 at home. They play the LA schools early.
Mentioned Makira Cook and Genesis Bryant. That's good news for Shauna Green. Here are 2 established stars, both coming back to Champaign.
Now, with this new schedule format, Illinois really benefits. They play Northwestern twice. Those are 2 teams that they know each other really well. I like Illinois' schedule.
As for Northwestern, what should we expect from the Cats after what I think everyone would say from that program, a disappointing season last year?
Tough year for Joe McEwen, but they're back, they're reloaded, they picked up some transfers like everyone else in the league, but they have their core back. Kate is back, they've got Mel Daly, she's back. So, we'll see how they do it. They'll be improved.
Hey, everybody's unbeaten before the year begins,
That's right.
Couple of more schedules to share with you before we wrap things up here on the women's side. Penn State and Carolyn Keeger, they were really close. This was a team that we thought maybe would get to the tournament. Then they suffered some late season injuries. They'll open up at home against Indiana. The 2-play is against Rutgers, both in late January and to finish up their season. And Minnesota opens up at Nebraska. The 2-play, again, border battle here with Wisconsin, and they'll get them out of the way early. They have the Badgers on New Year's Eve day on the road and then back home in late January. Continue our conversation on the men's side next. Dave and Robbie are back to look at what awaits the likes of the Hawkeyes, Gophers, and Nittany Lions. All that and more on this special Big Ten Live basketball schedule release show.
New men's coach Dusty May already making his presence felt in Ann Arbor and here on the Big Ten Network. He and women's coach Kim Barnes-Arico joined our Big Ten tailgate crew on the set Saturday. May coming from FAU, a program he took to the Final Four 2 years ago, and he brought his big man Vlad Golden with him. Here's the schedule for a team that finished last in the league for the first time in 57 years last season. They open in Madison, then come home for Iowa. The 2 plays Michigan State, Rutgers, and Purdue, so that is challenging. They play the Boilers twice in less than 3 weeks in late January and early February. 3 of their last 4 at home, including a game with Illinois on March the 2nd. As for Jake Diebler, who went from the interim coach to the full-time hire last year in Columbus, he and his young family enjoying a little Buckeye football were recognized at midfield during the season opener against Akron. Bucks won 8 of their last 11 with Diebler at the helm this past season. At Maryland, then home against Rutgers. Good tests early. First of their 2 games against Indiana comes at home on January 17th. Their West Coast swing is in late February in LA. Start on the expectations for those 2, and we'll start with Michigan. This is, again, a pretty big rebuild here, and yet there are some familiar faces who stick around here to help Dusty May get Michigan back to where it expects to be.
Yeah, Damari Burnett, a guy that's going to be leaned on because of his experience of being at the University of Michigan. This was, I think, the hire of the offseason when you talk about, being able to snag a coach in Dusty May that has been to the Final Four, that has had success. You look at who wanted him. Ohio State was mentioned. There was Louisville. There was big-time programs that wanted Dusty May to be their head basketball coach. Michigan ends up winning the sweepstakes. You look at the backcourt, it's so strange to be like, Roddy Gale goes from Ohio State to Michigan, but that's what he's doing. Trey Donaldson, a guy that was a very good player at Auburn last season. The front court's exciting as well. Vlad Golden and also Danny Wolf. Wolf's so skilled. Golden has that Final Four pedigree. I think Michigan, even though last year obviously didn't go the way that Wolverines fans hoped, this is a team that has talent. And it will, we've said this so many times, it will be about how they gel. That's really so important for a lot of teams this year.
Wonder a little bit about depth, but man,
no
2 7-footers up front, that's a pretty good place to start. Ohio State, there was so much momentum at the end of last year. Now the question is, can he carry it?
I think Jake Diebler very deserving of getting the opportunity to be the head basketball coach at Ohio State. They played a little bit faster. They were able to go on that run. They were knocking on the door of making the NCAA tournament, made the NIT. Michi Johnson, the comeback. The portal is a very strange place. He was at Ohio State. He went to South Carolina, played great last year, volume scorer. This is still Bruce Thornton's team, but Michi Johnson's a guy that can put the ball in the basket. The front court's interesting because you've got 2 guys in Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart that are McDonald's All-Americans, played at Duke and Kentucky respectively. Didn't maybe have the seasons that they were hoping last year, but there is no doubt that they have got talent. And again, how's it going to gel together? That's always the question for most of our teams in the league.
I would hope the change of scenery would help them. And again, guys who were stuck behind really great players at their prior stops. And maybe now is the time that they shine. Want to get you a few more schedules here. Iowa, they missed the tourney last year after making it the prior 4 years. Indiana, Purdue, Michigan State at home. Hoosiers in January, Boilers February, Spartans March. Robbie.
Well, I think for Iowa, getting Peyton Sanford back was so important because he goes through the NBA draft process. He's going to be a lock to be on the all-conference team. You got Owen Freeman back. Point guard, to me, is the big question. Is that Drew Thelwell comes over from Moorhead, or is that Brock Harding? But I think Iowa's a team that's flying under the radar. They've got a really good team.
Dawson Garcia's back in Minneapolis. Gophers made a nice jump last year. First 3 games are tough, but 2 are at home. Michigan State and Purdue sandwiched around that road trip to Indiana.
Yeah, that's a brutal start. You get Michigan State, you get Indiana. You're kind of hoping to get off to maybe a more slight start to your conference schedule, but it gets real for the Gophers very quickly.
Remember, they lose Cam Christie, Pharrell Payne, and Elijah Hawkins. What about Penn State here? Year 2 for Mike Rhodes. Ace Baldwin and company open with Purdue. Then they go to Rutgers. The Indiana game on January 5th is at the Palestra. Always a fantastic season.
And I think same thing for Penn State as we talked about with Minnesota. Their start of Purdue at Rutgers, Northwestern, Indiana at Illinois, Oregon, and at Michigan State. You're talking about schools and teams there that are going to be the favorites to really contend in this league. This Penn State team has a lot of talent back, and I like what Mike Rhodes was able to do last year, but it's going to be a gauntlet to start this year.
The dramatic conclusion of our show next. We will join forces with Rick and Shimmy, tell you the biggest storylines we'll be watching as we count down to Big Ten Basketball Media Days early next month.
We've shown you 33 of 36 conference schedules for Big Ten men and women. High-level math tells me 3 remain. Now 2 after Wisconsin opening up against Rutgers, finishing on the road at Iowa. The 2 plays against the border rival from Minnesota. As for Purdue, the Boilermakers with a tough start. They'll open at home against Maryland, then go back-to-back on the road against Iowa and Michigan State. And it is always tough when the 2 play is against the rivals from your home state, the Indiana Hoosiers. And last but not least, Rutgers opening up on the road at Wisconsin in early December, finishing against their 2-play opponent, Penn State. The first game comes on the road January 26th, and the home date for Rutgers to finish the year on March the 2nd. And so all 36 schedules have now been released. Rick Pizzo, Shimmy Miller, now back with Dave Revson and Robbie Hummel as well. Shimmy, we're also about 2 weeks away from Big Ten Basketball Media Days. What are you looking forward to hearing at Big Ten Media Days, and who are you looking forward to hearing from?
Well, we lost a lot on the women's side. You lose Caitlin Clark, J.C. Sheldon, Mac Holmes. So I'm most looking forward to seeing who's going to step up and take ownership of this Big Ten Women's Conference and be the face, the new face or faces of the conference, whether it's some of the transfers that are coming in or some of the new players, Kiki Rice, Kiki Iriafen, Juju Watkins. Who will emerge as the new face of the Women's Basketball Conference?
Yeah, kind of interesting that some of the new faces may be new looks to the Big Ten, and yet they're some of the best players that women's college basketball has to offer from any league with the likes of Juju Watkins.
Yeah, I, for one, am all in on watching Juju Watkins this year. It's going to be incredible. What about on the men's side, Robbie? What are you excited about?
I think the same thing as what Shimmy just said. We lost a lot of really high-end talent. Zach Edey, 2-time National Player of the Year. There's no more Boo Buie. There's no more Jameer Young, Marcus Damas, Terrence Shannon, Braden Smith, the lone member of that first-team All-Big Ten to return. So who are the guys that are taking the jump? Who are the new players coming into the conference? And honestly, whenever you get invited to Media Day as a player, it is such an honor because you understand the players that came before you, the coaches that are there, and you just see the kind of scope of how cool it is to be one of the guys that gets invited to be a part of Media Day.
It's going to be quite an extravaganza for 2 days. 18 teams in a day. That's no small feat. I don't want to make it about us, but man, it's going to be a lot.
It's going to be interesting. Hummel, how many times did you go to Media Day as a Purdue rep during your 9 years there?
I had 4.
4.
Well, you blow your knee out once, you get that 5th year.
You get the bonus.
You get the bonus
You
year.
get the extra
Media Day.
sympathy trip to Media Days.
Sympathy trip. All right,
Awesome stuff. That is in early October. Now, the schedule has been released. All we have to do is play, and in our case, watch, and in your case, analyze the games. For Shimmy Miller, Robbie Hummel, and Dave Revson, I'm Rick Pizzo. As always, we appreciate you spending some time with us right here on the Big Ten Network.